Good evening. Um, so, uh, Thanks for joining again. Um, in the first two lectures, yesterday and on Monday, I discussed pieces of my research that challenge common understandings about the Holocaust, and specifically why the complex set of events and processes that together we call the Holocaust, why they happened, when they happened, and also how they happened. So in a very basic way, I'm following my training as a historian and forefronting context and causes, both based on primary sources produced by the state, as I discussed yesterday in relation to Hungarian state violence against Jews and Roma and other people in the Carpathian region during World War II, and based on testimonies. Right? So in a very simple way, nothing that I'm doing in my research is very special. It's following what historians do. In both lectures, I argued and showed that we need to turn our attention to the importance of state violence and the targeting of a number of groups that state authorities considered foreign, dangerous, or otherwise a threat to the ethno-national and racist visions such as Greater Hungary and Greater Bulgaria. In other words, that the persecution and violence against Jews was connected to the persecution and violence against other groups. Roma in the Carpathian region, Greek Orthodox Christians and Muslims in Western Thrace, and remember that Muslims in Western Thrace also include Roma, and so on. That is, state violence against Jews was always tied to state violence against other groups. Tied, but also, as we discussed yesterday, also different. So the persecution and violence against Roma by the Hungarian occupiers in the Carpathian region differed from the persecution and violence against Jews there. That was rooted also in different historical understandings and definitions of Jews and Roma, as you noted yesterday, Peter. But both anti-Jewish and anti-Roma violence happened as part of the effort to realize the same nationalist and racist Greater Hungary vision. Now, remember that Lemkin described this state violence in the Hungarian case as a whole, right, looking at the entire system of state violence as genocide in his book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, and capturing its essential drive, to remember, quote, to impose a Hungarian pattern. That's how he described Hungarian genocidal violence as a whole. And I argued, following Lemkin and following the testimonies of Jews, that this genocidal project, which targeted different groups in different times, in different places, in different ways during the war, also targeted the social relations between the groups and the ties between the groups. That's why we can talk about the genocide of Roma by the Nazis and the genocide of Roma in Hungary, and we can talk about the genocide of Jews by the Nazis and genocide of Jews in Hungary. But we can also talk more broadly about Nazi genocide and Hungarian state violence as a genocidal project entirely. And we can therefore reconsider what the Holocaust actually was. And what are the implications of common understandings, maybe we should say hegemonic understandings, of the term the Holocaust? Also in scholarship, understandings that too often result in isolating and decontextualizing the persecution and violence against Jews across Europe and North Africa during World War II, that is, taking it away from the context in which it was embedded, right? Now, one last comment that will lead us to why we're stuck in the 20th century and what does that mean to be stuck in the 20th century. I demonstrated this decontextualization of the Holocaust and its effect through my readings of testimonies of Jews who describe themselves as bystanders to state violence against their non-Jewish neighbors across Southeast European borderlands, through my readings of testimonies of Jews and Roma in the Carpathian region who refer to each other, if you remember, in racist terms, in their testimonies, but also to relations with each other. And through my readings of the creation of these testimonies in a way that erases precisely these relations and their significance in understanding state violence in the past and in the present, and their significance in understanding diverse societies, including Jews, in the past and in the present. And again, not as a lost ideal world, but as normal social relations that nationalists saw as not normal in their drive for ethno-national and racist homogenization. Or in other words, knowledge production, right, the creation of the archive, the creation of the testimonies, structured by hegemonic understandings of the Holocaust, including its conceptual pillars, like bystanders, the creation of the archive ends up reproducing nationalist ideas, right, that isolate, that decontextualize, blurring the relations that characterize diverse societies, such as the ones in the Southeast European borderlands, that nationalists sought, but they still seek to break and remake. And indeed, they still seek, nationalists everywhere, to break and remake societies. Because as I suggest in the title of my lecture today, we are still stuck today in 2024 in precisely this sort of exclusionary violence that characterized the Holocaust in the way that I suggest we understand the term. This is why our world looks like it looks like today. From Myanmar's genocide against Rohingya for over a decade now, with 1 million Rohingya refugees in the most crowded and horrific refugee camps in Cox's Bazar on the border between Myanmar and Bangladesh today, through Russia's aggressive assault on Ukraine since 2014, to Israel's genocide in Gaza for over 14 months now. So let's delve into this extremely problematic world, but also into its potentials for change, right? It's not all dark and terrible, right? And not only potentials, actually, as we'll see, but change is actually already happening. So let's begin. United States Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez said in June 2019, in a short video, that the United States was running concentration camps on its southern border, interning refugees and asylum seekers. Does anyone remember this? Anyone? Okay. She added that never again should mean something. Now, certainly in the US, but I remember it's before the pandemic, who knows when that was, right? But I remember that also before, also not only in the US, but really all hell broke loose for a minute and a half, right? And this hell included a press release by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum on 24th of June, stating that the museum, quote, unequivocally rejects efforts to create analogies between the Holocaust and other events, whether historical or contemporary. You cannot compare the Holocaust to anything in the universe, really, ever. Now, this made no sense. This doesn't make any sense in any case. There is nothing that we can't compare to something else. Humans live by comparing all the time. We wake up in the morning and we're in comparison mode, right? It made no sense also because Ocasio-Cortez did not actually create an analogy. Rather, she tapped into the slogan of the USHMM itself, which is never again, what you do matters. That's the slogan of the USHMM. If we take that slogan seriously, it does, of course, necessitate analogies, for otherwise we cannot know that an unfolding process of state violence is unfolding in a way that turns on the red lights that Holocaust and genocide scholars like me and many others teach our students to detect, right? If we don't compare, we can't detect. That's the reason that many people viewed the USHMM press release as very strange. And particularly its extreme version of the idea that the Holocaust is unique. Almost 600 scholars which included nearly all Holocaust scholars in the world. Okay? Now, this is a group of people, Holocaust scholars, that if you put them together in the same room, they will kill each other, right, over their disagreements, right? All of them signed a letter, agreed very quickly to sign a letter to the USHMM demanding that the museum retract the statement because, quote, of its fundamentally ahistorical approach. They published the letter in the New Yorker, I think. Yeah. The first holder of the award is listed. Didn't matter. The USHMM, a federal institute subject to the authority of the United States government, doubled down on its position, even in the face of an overwhelming consensus among Holocaust scholars who otherwise disagree really on everything. Now, I have to say, the USHMM perhaps understood the absurdity of the situation because its press release, which I can show you, is nowhere to be found today on its website. Right? Nowhere. So if you find this piece, right, and you press the link, it's broken, right? It's okay. Now, it wasn't a coincidence that this press release came in response to what we call refugee crisis, right? The US-Mexico border. As I've noted already, more than 117 million people around the world today are forcibly displaced. That's again more than twice as many as at the end of World War II. These people have survived and fled destructive state violence should remind us of what many historians actually, such as Deborah Dwork and others, have shown in their work in the last 15 years, that the history of the Holocaust is also a history of refugees, primarily Jewish refugees. But in any case, we should not talk about 117 million people as a crisis in an otherwise functioning political system of nation states. Rather, these people expose the exclusionary and violent rationale of this system. They're not an exception, the 117 million people. They also lay bare a key problem in what we call global Holocaust memory, that is, again, as an institutional phenomena, including the USHMM, Yad Vashem, IRA that we mentioned yesterday and we'll mention more tomorrow. This memory culture maintains a set of ideas about the Holocaust, creates and maintains, first and foremost, that the Holocaust is unique, and we cannot, and we should not, and we must not compare it. And these ideas are maintained and created through state institutes in the West, including the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, and as state institutes, right, whether they're federal institutes or like Yad Vashem, which is an Israeli state institute, their aim and their rationale has always been to provide legitimacy to the state. That's what state institutes do, not to protect state victims. In other words, global Holocaust memory, tragically, as a state institute phenomena, never aimed at realizing never again. That was never actually the agenda. Now, nowhere is this problem more acute than in Israel, which emerged, as is well known, through the migration to Palestine and from 1948 to the State of Israel of Holocaust survivors and refugees, and through the mass deportations of more than 750,000 Palestinians whom Israeli forces turned into refugees. This large-scale state violence, the 1948 Nakba, also included massacres of thousands and the destruction of hundreds of Palestinians, towns, and villages. The founding of the Jewish nation state as a violent and exclusionary state, therefore, immediately came into acute tension with what everyone at the time actually knew very well about the Holocaust and refugees. Everyone understood this connection, right? And everyone also understood that the 1948 Nakba, right, produced hundreds of thousands of Palestinian refugees. It wasn't a secret, none of this, right? The idea of Holocaust uniqueness played an incredibly important role in responding to this tension from the very beginning, for it meant, the idea that the Holocaust is unique meant that Israel, the state where many Holocaust survivors tried to build their lives, is also unique. Right? If the Holocaust is unique, the state of the survivors is unique, especially, again, if we consider the triad of uniqueness that I mentioned yesterday, right? Holocaust unique, Israel unique, but it's really all based on the idea that Jews are a unique people, right? And indeed, foundational in the Judeo-Christian world. Now, the concept of genocide functioned from its formulation in the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide in December 1948, the year of Israel's creation. The concept of genocide functioned in relation to this double uniqueness, Holocaust in Israel. Nazism, and what we now call the Holocaust, because at the time no one used the term, of course, it took quite a long time until the term emerged. Nazism and the Holocaust were imagined on a hierarchy as more terrible than genocide, right? What we now call Holocaust and genocide studies, right? Which placed Israel on another imagined hierarchy as more moral than any other state in the world. This gave rise to a common view in Israel and the West that the Israeli army is the most moral in the world. That's a very strange idea in any case, and it's actually based on a very dangerous idea that somehow Jews are not humans, right? Because somehow their army doesn't do what any army in human history always has done, right? So from Israel's establishment, it became unimaginable and unspeakable that Israel would, that it actually can, right, perpetrate any crime under international law, let alone genocide. Right? The system of uniqueness, right, basically baked impunity for Israel into the new international legal system with its crime of genocide as its key innovation, right? And into Holocaust memory from the very beginning, before we even have this idea of Holocaust memory. Israeli impunity. It also meant that the denial of the 1948 Nakba, Israel's foundational crime, right, which of course exposed that this uniqueness, right, and impunity are ridiculous. Again, everyone knew that this had just happened, right? The denial of the Nakba emerged also as a structural element in the international legal system and in Holocaust memory from the very beginning. Nakba denial. It's remarkable then that Israeli leaders, politicians, and journalists have used the word Nakba numerous times since 7th of October 2023. Now, admitting rather than denying the 1948 Nakba and pushing for a second Nakba. These are just two, there are so many. Everything that I'll note this evening, there is a mountain of evidence, right? A mountain of evidence, right? These are just two relatively well-known examples, right? One is Ariel Kalner, a member of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament for the ruling Likud party, Benjamin Netanyahu's party, who already on 7th of October 2023 on X wrote, Nakba to the enemy now. Now only one goal, Nakba. Nakba that will overshadow the Nakba of 1948. Notice how many times he uses the word Nakba in these short sentences. Israeli cabinet minister Avi Dichter described the second Nakba on Israeli TV openly in November 2023 as the Gaza Nakba. Now, perpetrators of state violence very rarely shift from denial, Nakba denial, to recognition in this way. certainly not during unfolding violence, right? This is very, very exceptional. We see it in this case because of the perpetrator's state of mind. Israeli leaders and soldiers and officers who have documented their own crimes in Gaza in thousands of videos, thousands, right? Many of them are online for you to view if you like. And uploaded the evidence onto social media. Imagine, that's why they've documented their own crimes in this way. Imagine that they are fighting a colonial war against human animals. As Israeli War Minister Yoav Gallant described Palestinians in Gaza on 9th of October. And I insist to describe former Israeli War Minister now as War Minister and not Defense Minister. Right? It's very important that we use language carefully. There's nothing defensive in Yoav Gallant's policies. Such explicit language, human animals, brings to mind German General Lotto von Trotha, the German colonial genocide in German Southwest Africa in the early 20th century. The German general in charge, Lotto von Trotha, his response to a very violent uprising by the Herero people under German colonial occupation, where they also attacked, by the way, German settlers and their families. His response was to issue an extermination order. That order signaled the beginning of the German genocide of the Herero and Nama people. And similarly, Israelis perceived their genocidal assault on Palestinians after the Hamas-led attack on October 7th as a war against colonized barbarians. This is, in other words, Israeli settler colonialism taken to its horrific conclusion. Indeed, Israeli war on Palestinians began well before October 7th. Israelis have been waging it in various ways since the 1948 Nakba, including, very important that we don't forget, a 16-year siege on Gaza before October 7th, which is the longest siege in modern history, right? A siege in which the Israeli authorities calculated the calories that Palestinians could eat. By the way, the idea of starving Palestinians in Gaza specifically has a history that goes back all the way to immediately after the 1967 war when Israel occupied the Gaza Strip. Already then, immediately, Israeli authorities were talking about the possibility of what to do with the Gaza Strip, which is a big problem, right? And one of the possibilities on the table immediately after the 1967 war was to starve Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. This Israeli war on Palestinians is what Palestinians have always described as an ongoing Nakba, aimed at realizing Israeli settler colonialism, the creation of a greater Israel with as few Palestinians as possible and as many Jews as possible. And don't take my word on Israeli settler colonialism. Don't take the words of Palestinians on Israeli settler colonialism. Take the word of Zionists and Israelis on Israeli settler colonialism, right? That they have described the Israeli project, the Zionist project, as settler colonialism. There's so much work on that as well. But again, if you'd like, happy to open the discussion on Israel as a settler colonial project, right? Nakba denial then always required that Israelis depict Palestinians as far away from victims and refugees as possible, not only in typical colonial terms of dehumanization, human animals, barbarians, but also as the ultimate evil. What's the ultimate evil? Nazis. Among the more well-known examples of this history, for all of this, there's a long history in Israeli history, right? Is Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin comparing in 1982, in the context of that Israel's attack on Lebanon, Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat in Beirut to Adolf Hitler in his bunker in Berlin at the end of World War II. Three decades later, in October 2015, it was Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu who took this weaponization to a new level when he asserted in a speech to the World Zionist Congress in Jerusalem that it was the Palestinian Grand Mufti, Haj Amin al-Husseini, who planted the idea to murder Jews in Hitler's mind. Yeah, Hitler didn't want to murder the Jews, but Haj Amin al-Husseini said, oh, we should murder the Jews. What an idea. This was, of course, an unashamed fabrication, right? Without any basis whatsoever in historical reality. Another case, by the way, that there was almost in full consensus among Holocaust scholars who otherwise deeply hate each other, especially in relation to these kinds of issues, right? That came out and said, this is not true, right? They said it in stronger terms, but the stage was thus set for yet more extreme Holocaust weaponization by Israel after October 7th. Former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett fired the first shots of this extreme weaponization in an interview on Sky News on October 12th. It was really a tantrum more than an interview. I don't know if you know what I'm referring to here. It's more than 14 months now. He responded to a question about a high civilian death toll already in the first few days of Israel's attack on Gaza, because we forget that actually the first few weeks were incredibly brutal, right? And we forget who the perpetrators of that brutality are, the pilots, right? They're extremely brutal first few weeks. And there was a very high death toll. He was asked about this, and his response was very short. He said, we're fighting Nazis. 5 days later, Netanyahu described Hamas as the new Nazis, speaking in a press conference with none other than the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. And a couple of weeks later, on 5th of November, Israeli Heritage Minister Amichai Eliyahu, who's a member of the far-right Jewish Power Party, that's how it's called, Jewish Power Party, expressed in a radio interview his objection to humanitarian aid for Palestinians in Gaza by saying, quote, we would not hand the Nazis humanitarian aid. Eliyahu thus demonstrated the slippage in Israeli politics, media, and society from describing only Hamas as Nazis to describing all Palestinians as Nazis. And he also suggested the possibility of dropping a nuclear bomb on Gaza, right? Which of course makes no sense also from an Israeli perspective. But, let's put reality aside here, of course. Israel's attack on Gaza has in fact included the dropping so far of more than 90,000 tons of explosives, which are the equivalent of more than 3 atomic bombs of the kind that the US dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. Israeli bombings and invasions have left the Gaza Strip, as we can all see with our eyes, in utter ruin, because Israel targets everything in the Gaza Strip. Everything. Residential buildings, hospitals, schools, all the universities, cultural sites, archives, museums, bakeries, agricultural fields. There are places in Gaza where there were only agricultural fields, and they were targeted, bombed from the very first days. There was nothing else there. Israel has so far killed, according to UN estimates, around 45,000 Palestinians, including over 16,000 children. Many of them in areas where Israel has also forced Palestinians to seek refuge as safe zones. Israel has thus weaponized also international humanitarian law that is designed to protect civilians, actually in order to enhance the targeting of civilians. This is what Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories, called humanitarian camouflage, right? And we know this because even the New York Times, November or December 2023, right, published a big investigative piece that showed that Israel used its most powerful destructive bombs, the 2,000-ton bombs, US made, right, in safe zones. The real number of Palestinians that Israel has killed so far in Gaza is, of course, most likely far higher than the UN estimates. The bodies of over 12,000 people remain under the rubble, fleeced. And a recent letter in October to Biden by 99 US physicians and other healthcare workers who have volunteered to work in Gaza after October 7th notes that Israel has killed so far nearly 120,000 Palestinians. That's the assessment of the doctors. If that's true, we're talking about more than 5% of the total population of the Gaza Strip. And continuing, of course. Israel's attack has also wounded over 100,000 people and forcibly displaced nearly all of the entire 2.3 million Palestinians who are now facing acute food insecurity and famine conditions, a result of Israel's total siege policies that Gallant declared on 9th of October when he described Palestinians as human animals. Now, if it remained unclear whether Gallant was describing again only Hamas militants in this way or all Palestinians in Gaza, the next day on 10th of October, coordinator of government activities in the territories, Israeli Major General Hassan Aliyan, clarified it in a video that he recorded specifically for the Palestinians in Gaza, where he said the following: Hamas has turned into ISIS, and the residents of Gaza, instead of being appalled, are celebrating. Human animals must be treated as such. There will be no electricity, no water. There will only be destruction. You wanted hell. You will get hell. Openly. Now, many other Israeli state leaders, war cabinet ministers, and senior army officers, that is, people with command authority in international law, right, have cast Palestinians as a whole, right, as enemies, as human animals, as Nazis, immediately after October 7th and the months that followed, and still today. A couple weeks ago, Israeli finance minister Bezalel Smotrich, far-right settler, right, openly said that Israel should occupy the entire Gaza Strip, right, and halve the population, right, decimate the population by removing them, of course, right. He didn't say that by killing them, but it should, decimate the population in half, openly. Dozens of these explicit statements, again, people with command authority. In terms of genocidal rhetoric more broadly in Israeli society and politics and media, we're talking about hundreds of statements of genocide, right? Law for Palestine has documented all of them on its website, if you're interested. These statements demonstrate clearly Israel's, quote, intent to destroy, in the language of the UN Genocide Conventions, intend to destroy Palestinians as such. That is because they are Palestinians. The Israeli army then has done exactly that, what Israeli leaders declared. It has turned Gaza into a place, in the language of Hassan Aliyan, only destruction and hell. In addition to the unprecedented dimensions of destruction and killing, which are unprecedented since World War II, Israel's mass starvation policies have, again to quote from the convention, deliberately inflicted on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Third act of genocide. Indeed, we know that if Israel's attack stops now, Palestinians in Gaza will continue to die in large numbers from hunger, disease, exposure, and the lasting effects of the physical and psychological trauma that Israel has caused them. And we're talking in the hundreds of thousands. Okay, this is documented in the well-known Lancet article, but in many other expert opinions. This is a result of the conditions that Israel has indeed intentionally created in its attack. Gallant told us on 9th of October, right, that they are imposing total siege. Importantly, Palestinians in Gaza understood the destructive nature of the attack against them from the very beginning. And I'm quoting here from text messages and voice messages that Palestinians have been sending outside of Gaza, again, from the very beginning, and just a few, there's many, many others. A community worker, started sending WhatsApp messages to friends on October 10th. There were only 3 words in the first one: terror, terror, terror. October 15th, he wrote, "They are killing families, whole families. I want to forget what I saw. You can't imagine, beyond reality." 2 days later, water and food, none, very little. We went to sleep in 2023 and woke up in 1948, he noted on October 18th. Andalib Adwan, a feminist writer and educator from Gaza City, remarked in a WhatsApp message on October 9th that the situation is indescribable. The horror is beyond imagination. On October 13th, she arrived with her family in Rafah, a safe zone at the time, and 4 days later experienced, quote, "bombing all around us. There are so many dead and injured." And finally, Palestinian poet Khiba Abu Nada wrote on October 9th that Israel's attack this time, she says, follows no pattern. Everything is being bombed, Gaza from the north to the south, being bombed on a chaotic, catastrophic manner, mass butchery, senseless assassination of everything. Now, anyone who knows just a little bit about the Holocaust, you don't need to know a lot, just a little bit about the Holocaust, will immediately recognize in horror so much dehumanization of people who reach out in their, these are really kind of real-time testimonies to call our attention to catastrophe, butchery, senseless assassination of everything. And it's precisely the history of the Holocaust that reminds us to center the voices of those facing state violence and genocide. But as the USHMM response to Ocasio-Cortez in 2019 showed, institutes of global Holocaust memory function as state institutes and thus serve the interests of those states, including Israel, not the millions of forcibly displaced people around the world, most of them in a global South. It was therefore by no accident that a global South state, South Africa, challenged this weaponization of the Holocaust by bringing the charge of genocide against Israel in its submission to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, on 29th of December 2023. Now, it's well known that the ICJ issued 3 provisional measure rulings in January, in March, and in May, finding that South Africa succeeded in arguing that it is plausible that Israel is perpetrating genocide against Palestinians in Gaza. Plausible because we're not in the merit stage yet, right? Now, as Israel's impunity in the international legal system emerged, as I suggested, in direct relation to the new crime of genocide after World War II, right, as the basis of its impunity, these rulings of the ICJ, with all the shortcomings that they have, right, mark the beginning of the end of this impunity. And this is already a very important development. It was particularly significant that the first provisional measure ruling in January happened a few hours before the hearing in another case related to Israel's genocide that the Center for Constitutional Rights in the United States filed in federal court in California on behalf of Palestinian organizations and individuals against President Biden, Secretary of State Blinken, and Secretary of Defense Austin. The Center for Constitutional Rights charged them in their capacity as US government leaders with failure to abide by the legal obligations of states, according to the UN Genocide Convention, to prevent genocide in Gaza. That's a legal obligation of all the signatories to the convention, right? But more than that, of course, they charged them with complicity with genocide due to the continued US military and diplomatic support to Israel after October 7th. Has anyone heard about the CCR case? Well, good. Well, not good, but let's talk about it because it's very important. Remarkably, Judge Jeffrey S. White, a Trump appointee, by the way, allowed Palestinian plaintiffs to testify in court that day. Both those who live in the US but were born and grew up in Gaza, and those who were then in the West Bank and Gaza. One after the other, over 5 hours of testimonies that you can all find online. They told the court about their family histories during the Nakba, their own experiences of Israeli mass violence, relatives they've lost after 7th of October, neighborhoods in which they grew up that are no more, schools that Israeli bombings and invasion have turned to rubble, cafes where they will never drink tea again, and many, many feelings of dread and loss. 5 hours of testimonies. Dr. Omer al-Najjar testified via Zoom from the hospital in Rafah, where he worked then around the clock with barely any medical supplies. And he said many things, but he also said this, which is very simple. I've lost everything in this war. I have nothing but my grief. This is what Israel and its supporters have done to us. Ahmed Abu Foul, a Palestinian lawyer working for Al-Haq, which is a Ramallah-based Palestinian human rights organization, very old, described the organization, very old, described how his grandfather had refused to leave Gaza City in October 2023, even as his relatives told him that they would later return. This is exactly what they told me in 1948, his grandfather responded, having survived the Nakba but never able to return to the place where he grew up. Dr. al-Najjar, Ahmed Abu Foul, and other Palestinians in court that day said the word Nakba dozens and dozens of times, again and again. Never before had the word Nakba been uttered in a US federal court so many times in one day, in one 5-hour stretch. Affirming with a force of truth embodied in this word that we have entered a new period beyond Israeli unity as it intertwined with Nakba denial. Now, following the Palestinian plaintiffs came the turn of Holocaust scholar Barry Trachtenberg to take the stand. He testified about the declaration that he had submitted together with fellow Holocaust and Genocide Studies scholars Victoria Sanford and John Cox in support of the CCR case. Drawing on his work on the failure of the US to respond on time to the Nazi assault on Jews, Trachtenberg stressed the significance of Holocaust memory in the US and the urgent need that the US government does not repeat its failure and act to stop Israel's unfolding genocide in Gaza. Now, Judge White decided on 31st of January to dismiss the case on procedural and jurisdictional grounds because he could not, in his view, interfere in government decision-making related to foreign policy. And there's a massive debate on this legal doctrine, but that's what he decided. He nevertheless issued an unprecedented ruling, and that's what he said. He said, both the uncontroverted testimony of the plaintiffs, the Palestinian testimonies, the expert opinion, Barry Trachtenberg, as well as statements made by various officers of the Israeli government, intent to destroy, indicate that the ongoing military siege in Gaza is intended to eradicate a whole people and therefore plausibly falls within the international prohibition against genocide. He then referenced the ICJ ruling, provisional ruling just a few hours previous, and said that it is plausible that Israel's conduct amounts to genocide, and therefore the court implores defendants, Biden, Blinken, and Austin, to examine the results of their unflagging support of the military siege against the Palestinians in Gaza Now, considering the numerous U.S. arms shipments to Israel after the ruling, Biden, Blinken, and Austin have clearly not listened to Judge White, certainly not to the Palestinians who testified in his courtroom, and they've also waved away Holocaust scholars like Barry Trachtenberg. Indeed, Biden himself set the stage for the weaponization of the Holocaust when he visited Israel on October 18th, 2023, and said the following: Hamas committed atrocities that recall the worst ravages of ISIS. At the beginning, there was this attempt to tie this to ISIS, if you remember or don't remember. It didn't work so well, so we moved to Nazis. Unleashing pure, unadulterated evil upon the world. October 7th, which was a sacred Jewish holiday, became the deadliest day for the Jewish people since the Holocaust. It has brought to the surface painful memories and scars left by millennia of anti-Semitism and the genocide of the Jewish people. The world watched then, it knew, and the world did nothing. We will not stand by and do nothing again. Now, with these words, Biden presented to us a world turned upside down. Instead of the reality of a powerful state and nuclear power, with powerful allies and a powerful army, engaged in an attack against stateless Palestinians under decades of Israeli settler colonial rule, military occupation, and siege. And for all of this, again, there's a mountain of evidence and a library of research, right? Biden cast Israel as powerless Jews in a struggle against Nazis, right? The ultimate victim of modern imagination against the ultimate perpetrator of modern imagination. The historical context of Israeli settler colonialism, of course, in no way justifies the mass murder of hundreds of Israelis and migrant workers and the taking of over 240 hostages in the Hamas-led attack on 7th of October. This was the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. But the context, to go back to this bread and butter of historians, is absolutely different from the context of the attack on Jews during the Holocaust. And without the historical context of Israeli history, since the 1948 Nakba, we cannot explain how we got here, nor can we imagine different futures for those who are interested in this endeavor. Biden offered us instead the decontextualized image of pure, unadulterated evil. Now, wielding the Holocaust as a weapon has characterized another case of mass violence not too long ago. On 24th of January, 2020, not too long ago, this wonderful person was invited to speak. You know where he is? You can see a bit. There's a hint here. The 5th World Holocaust Forum at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem to mark 75 years to the liberation of Auschwitz by Soviet forces. In his speech, Putin presented a distorted history of the Second World War and the Holocaust, including distorted maps. All the Yad Vashem historians were sitting in the audience. He did this to fit a Russian narrative, contemporary Russian narrative, that one of its key elements are that Ukrainians were primarily Nazi collaborators. Not some, all. Putin used precisely this weaponization of Holocaust history, which he created in no other place than Yad Vashem, right, when he launched his assault on Ukraine in February 2022. Explaining it, as you remember, I hope, as a campaign of denazification. There are so many Nazis around, right? Explicit and unashamed, just like Bennett, just like Netanyahu, just like Mikhailiyahu and other Israeli leaders, and like Biden, Putin used the Holocaust to create a world turned upside down. Ukrainians facing a brutal and unprovoked Russian attack became Nazis. It should not come as a surprise, therefore, that Putin also resorted to Holocaust uniqueness in Jerusalem in January 2020, but with a twist, a weaponization of weaponization. On the day before the forum, Putin joined Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu in dedicating a memorial in Jerusalem to the German siege of Leningrad during World War II. And during his speech there, he said, the Holocaust and the siege of Leningrad cannot be compared to anything else. Sounds familiar? Putin added something for us, right? Now, Polish President then, Andrzej Duda, and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky were not invited to speak in the forum. Duda just said that he's not coming. Zelensky, took the free trip to Israel, but eventually decided not to attend the event. Yad Vashem historian Chavi Dreyfus wrote in the Israeli newspaper Haaretz a couple of weeks after this shameful event that the scholars working at Yad Vashem were not in any way involved in what she describes will be remembered as one of the low points in the struggle about the historical story. There's much more to say about this, right, if you want afterwards. But let's go back to Biden. He resorted to the weaponization of the Holocaust, right? You're starting to see how we're stuck in the 20th century? Yeah? He resorted to this not only immediately after October 7th in the heat of the moment, right, but also in a speech in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum on 7th of May to mark Israeli Holocaust Memorial Day. They will not leave the Holocaust alone, right? And he said, this ancient hatred of Jews did not begin with the Holocaust. It didn't end with the Holocaust. That hatred was brought to life on October 7th on a sacred Jewish holiday. The terrorist group Hamas unleashed the deadliest day of the Jewish people since the Holocaust, driven by ancient desire to wipe out the Jewish people off the face of the earth. Just as a trope of ancient hatreds served to blur the key role of colonialism and nationalism and the conditions that led to the genocide in Rwanda in 1994, here too Biden erased Israeli settler colonialism, ethno-nationalism, and decades of Israeli state violence against Palestinians. As if to underline the cruel absurdity of this crude denial, while Biden was speaking in Washington, D.C., in the museum, Israel crossed one of his own red lines to Israel, right, and proceeded in its deadly invasion of Rafah. Now, the extent of U.S. support for Israel this past year has surprised and shocked many around the world, because it is in the face of constantly escalating violence, now including also an intensification of Israeli mass murder of Palestinians and its renewed total siege and attack in northern Gaza, right? U.S. support for Israel is also in the face of the largest mass protest movement in the U.S. since the Vietnam War and massive protest movement around the world, in the face of numerous Palestinian citizens of the U.S. who have lost family members in Gaza, in the face of an Israeli society and media immersed, unashamed in open genocidal rhetoric, in the face of Israel killing now more than 120 journalists in Gaza, unprecedented, more than 308 workers, UN staff, in the face of the killing of US citizens in Gaza by Israeli forces, in the face of the International Court of Justice, the ICC, all major human rights organizations, numerous UN reports, the angry resignations of officials in the US government, some of them Jews. In the face of a regional war that Israel tried to create and is still trying to create, in the face of Israel spitting in the US government's face as it crossed all Biden's red lines, only to receive every time more weapons, more ammunition, more money. to continue killing and destroying. So many people asked, right, why? Why do we see such massive US support, right? Of course, Israel has supported Israel and Israel's settler colonialism at least since 1967 fiercely, right? But this is really unprecedented. The answer is rooted not just in the obvious denial of what we all see in front of our eyes and on our screens. It also harks back to the denial of the Nakba and the denial of its rationale, the denial of Israeli settler colonialism. This denial has now become particularly absurd when senior ministers in the Israeli government declare their settler plans for Gaza in large public events, including in relation to the quote-unquote Israeli General Plan, which is public, about northern Gaza. And as the extremely violent Israeli settler project in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem has intensified enormously in the last 14 months. No matter, the US government must deny Israeli settler colonialism, for recognizing this very well-documented reality, past and present, may open the floodgates and force recognition also with settler colonialism in the US. Once the settler colonial genie is out the bottle, right, we have to come to terms with it everywhere. But also in the US, it's denied and blurred and rationalized. It would mean, in other words, coming to terms not only with the foundational crime of the Israeli state, but also that of the US state. And it would lay bare what the USHMM press release in response to Ocasio-Cortez in 2019 had already revealed to us, that our world is not actually a post-Holocaust world. We live in a world structured politically and ideologically around colonialism and nationalism, as the Holocaust world was. And again, there's much more to say about the reproduction, right, of this world, but we see it in front of our eyes now, right? In Israel, very paradigmatically, right, but everywhere. As I close in the next 7-8 minutes, I also wanted to suggest that we are also living in a time of change that few could have actually imagined before October 7th. Precisely because the voices of Palestinians who are facing Israel's genocidal assault are now, for the first time in the history of the ongoing Nakba, front and center around the world, also in national and international courts, from California to The Hague. This marks an era beyond impunity for Israel, an era when the crime of genocide can serve now, not as it emerged to blur the Nakba, to deny Israeli state violence, and to legitimize Israeli settler colonialism, but to support the struggle against it and the effort to envision a different decolonial world. It is furthermore the voices of Palestinians that now point to a new era also of Holocaust memory. This is very important. It's Palestinians who are now pointing us to a new era of Holocaust memory, when the promise to center the experiences of survivors and forcibly displaced people may finally be realized. This vision is what I call, I'm writing about this a bit these days, global Nakba memory. Global Nakba memory. Now, it's very difficult to envision it because of the unprecedented destruction that continues to unfold in Gaza, but also in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, in Lebanon. Now, global Nakba memory challenges global Holocaust memory at its core. It transforms genocide prevention, right, this obligation, from an ideal that was never meant to be realized. It was meant to remain elusive. It transformed this to specific actions driven by a shift from structural Nakba denial to an insistence on something that is supposed to be very simple, truth, right, in front of our eyes, on our screens. A shift that has mobilized hundreds of thousands of people around the world this past year. The impact of this mobilization, I want to argue, cannot be overstated. Large-scale protests throughout the fall of 2023 normalized the use of the term genocide to describe Israel's attack on Gaza, laying the groundwork, without a doubt, for South Africa to bring the charge of genocide against Israel at the ICJ. The ICJ provisional measures then prompted an expansion of divestment initiatives against Israel as companies, including tech giants like Intel, right, became concerned with legal implications due to complicity with Israel's genocide, because the Genocide Convention also includes the crime of complicity with genocide, right? Should they continue conducting business in and with Israel? Foreign investors have thus withdrawn billions of dollars from the Israeli stock market since October 7th. And students in encampments on hundreds of campuses in the spring, in the US and beyond, then demanded that their universities divest from companies that enable Israel's genocide. These encampments furthermore constituted real anti-racist places, where Jews, Palestinians, Christians, Muslims, Black people, men, women, queer people, others stood in real solidarity with each other and with Palestinians. This shift to truth, especially among faculty and students on numerous universities around the world, has been met, unfortunately, especially in the US, with brutal police assaults on faculty members and students, and new regulations severely limiting protests and forbidding the use of chalk to write the truth on the sidewalk, for example, right? I tell students we should go outside and write 2 + 2 = 4 on the sidewalk, right? And see what happens. Many universities have also weaponized the struggle against anti-Semitism by tagging any critique of Israel as anti-Semitic, designed to intimidate and silence. Faculty members working as adjunct professors without tenure have consequently lost teaching jobs, and this is in the hundreds, probably more. I don't know if you've heard about the sensational firing of tenured anthropologist, Jewish anthropologist Mara Finkelstein from Muhlenberg College in Pennsylvania in the US, which signals a system operating in real panic mode. This was for retweeting something. A tenured Jewish faculty member. This is clear also in the targeting of many Jewish students and faculty members because of their anti-Jewish, anti-Zionist stance and activism, as in the case of Finkelstein. This means that now universities are censoring Jews for the way they express their Jewish identities. Anti-Zionism is a way to express a Jewish identity, right? Unlike criticizing a state, Israel, and a political ideology, Zionism, censoring Jews for expressing their Jewish identity is, you know what it is? Anti-Semitism. Real anti-Semitism. It's not surprising that universities have engaged in other outright anti-Semitic acts. For example, dismantling Sukkot, right? The Jewish holiday of Sukkot. Jews against Israeli state violence have created Sukkot, right, on campuses. What did the university do? Dismantle their Sukkot, dismantle, right, a Jewish holiday practice. Universities have thus exposed their preference for an ideology of settler colonialism over their professed commitment to truth through research and teaching. As senior university administrators do away with any remaining liberal facade and pretenses, right, they also demonstrate the power of insistence on truth as collective action, which continues even as this repression grows. A few more minutes. Israel, meanwhile, has intensified its destructive assault against Palestinians in Gaza and everywhere else under Israeli rule. In the West Bank, including in East Jerusalem, Israel has followed open government plans to annex the entire area and expel Palestinians en masse. This is the West Bank and East Jerusalem. Israeli army and security forces, acting in full coordination with Jewish settlers, there's about 1 million of them, by the way, in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, right? Jewish settlers, have realized part of this plan already before October 7th. The killing of nearly 200 Palestinians between January and early October 2023 created an atmosphere of terror that left almost no Palestinians in the vast area stretching east from Ramallah all the way to Yericho. Since October 7th, Israeli state authorities and settlers have killed more than 730 Palestinians in the West Bank, while destroying and forcibly displacing 16 communities in their entirety. In some cases, the attack of the Israeli army resembles its conduct in Gaza. In Jenin last August and early September, for instance, Israeli forces bombed from the air, bulldozed many streets, destroyed vital infrastructure, attacked hospitals, and killed and injured dozens of Palestinians. Israel has also arrested thousands of Palestinians from Gaza and the West Bank since October 2023, transforming more than a dozen civilian and military prisons into torture camps. Nearly 2 million Palestinian citizens of Israel, so we have the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Gaza, but we have almost 2 million Palestinians who are citizens of the state, also face acute danger, as the state has treated them since October 7th now outright as enemies. Now, this view, of course, dates back to the military rule imposed from 1948 to 1966 on the 156,000 Palestinians who survived the Nakba within the territory that became Israel. Now, Israeli Police Commissioner Kobi Shabtai confirmed the persistence of this view when he threatens in October 2023 to expel to Gaza Israeli Palestinians identifying with Palestinians there in any way. The Israeli police then arrested hundreds of Israeli Palestinians for any expression of sympathy with Palestinians in Gaza, including the cruel and dehumanizing arrest this last April of internationally renowned Palestinian scholar Nadira Shalab-Kevorkian at her home in Jerusalem. I don't know if you heard about this case. Itamar Ben-Gvir, the far-right settler who serves as Minister of National Security, terrorized Palestinians further by distributing thousands of weapons to Israeli Jewish civilians who have formed hundreds of self-defense units in Israel since October 7th. The levels of violence, of course, of domestic violence, violence against women, killing of people by accident, and so on and so forth, with the flooding of weapons into the society has, of course, skyrocketed in the last year. And for over a year now, Israeli Palestinians live in a society immersed in genocidal rhetoric and awash with war criminals who have killed, destroyed, plundered in Gaza, and posted their crimes proudly on social media. These are the neighbors of these Palestinian Israelis. As Israel intensifies the regional war that it has created, the view of Israeli Palestinians as enemy within puts them in extreme danger. In other words, we're very much still in the realm of genocide prevention, certainly if we think about the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Palestinian Israelis. Enemies within, like the plight of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire at the beginning of World War I, when the state saw them as collaborators with the Russian enemy, and thus as enemies themselves, enemies within. The result, as we know, was the Armenian genocide. It was the destruction, actually, of the Ottoman Armenians that prompted Polish Jewish legal scholar Raphael Lemkin to begin formulating his ideas about a new crime in international law that eventually he called genocide, an endeavor meant to prevent this sort of violence from ever happening again. Now, Palestinian legal scholar Rabia Egbaria has recently proposed Nakba as a new legal concept that differs yet overlaps with genocide. And after more than a century of failures to realize the vision of genocide prevention, I propose that it is this emergent global Nakba memory that figures as a crucial force in the struggle to prevent Israel's plans of bringing the Nakba to continue. If we understand this as an ongoing Nakba, and the danger now that Palestinians everywhere in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Israel, of course, those who remain in Gaza, face. This struggle in the frame of global Nakba memory, thinking about Nakba as a new crime in international law, as Akbaria suggests, points to a post-Nakba world. Something that, of course, global Holocaust memory never pointed to because it was precisely aimed at blurring and denying the Nakba. That would then also mark then a truly post-Holocaust world. In other words, we can't get to post-Holocaust without post-Nakba. It is very difficult to envision such a world today as Israel's extreme violence continues. But it has already started to emerge. It really has already started to emerge. And it would really be, when it happens, liberation for Palestinians, and very belatedly also for Jews. Thank you. Two, three. Let's start with these three here. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you. I have actually one comment and two questions for you. I mean, the first comment is, I mean, you've gone relatively quickly over what happened on October 7 and the impact on the Israeli traumatic experience, the impact on the pressure it got on their politicians, I think. And to some extent, I'm wondering what could have been, I mean, the alternatives, I mean, for the politicians in Israel in October last year. What, I mean, do you think could have been done differently given the huge political pressure from all parts, including from people who are not hardcore Netanyahu supporters? That's the first question. And the second question is, given where we are now, I mean, what happens next? And what do you think is the path to some form of a solution or a peace?
Yeah, we'll take the questions and then you had a question here?
You can hear me? Yeah. Thank you very much for the presentation. I have a question about the word Nakba and the meaning and how it is used by Israelis, because I think the meaning has a really negative connotation. So I don't really understand why Israelis use it.
Thank you very much for the presentation. In fact, I have to say that regarding the times we are living in, it's quite a refreshing view of what can happen next, because all what has been denied for the last 75 years, now you see, I can see from what you said, a way to think differently Holocaust, Israel, and the way the Jews are considered in Western Europe. I remember well a few years ago, President Macron in France invited Mr. Netanyahu to commemorate the Rafle du Veldiv, French event during the Second World War. And a lot of people were just thinking, but why did he convey Mr. Netanyahu as an Israel head of government in order to represent all the Jews? And the question is now, do we have to consider that all the Jews could be seen as some Israeli supporters? And in the last year, in the medias, this is some things that we have seen a lot. So what I wanted to hear from you also is the point of the international law. As you said, Holocaust is seen as unique, Israel is seen as unique, and we have the impression that the international law, Israel is amongst the international law. How do you see a future for the international law following what happened recently?
Okay, so let's start with these. Look, there's no way to minimize the impact of an attack like the Hamas attack on 7th of October on the population under attack. Okay? And the last person, I hope, to provide any kind of rationalization for any sort of mass murder, right, would be a Holocaust and genocide study scholar. Right? I think, and you know, I wrote as much immediately after on my Jewish Currents piece on 13th of October. Yeah, I mentioned that I see the Hamas attack as a case of war crimes and mass murder, right? So I was very clear from the very beginning on how I see this. Now, what were the alternatives? That's what you asked, right? Genocide is illegal under international law in any case, right? You cannot respond to anything with genocide, okay? So what are the alternatives? Not this for sure. That's the first thing to say, right? Not genocide, right? What are the alternatives? Well, maybe thinking about a simple fact. The Zionist project promised Israeli Jews. What did it promise Israeli Jews? Security. Are Israeli Jews secure today? If there's anything we can learn from the 7th of October, is that this promise has failed miserably, right? Because when you hold millions of people under illegal military occupation, right? When you rob them, humiliate them, take their land and deny it at the same time, right? Who can be secure in that area? And again, this is not to justify mass murder. It's to state an obvious fact. Vladimir Jabotinsky, the father of revisionist Zionism, right-wing Zionism, in 1923 wrote a very, very well-known essay, The Iron Wall. You've heard about it? The Iron Wall? You're not studying Zionism here? In this? The Iron Wall was, it's a great essay. It's a great essay for teaching because you can find it fully translated to English on the Jabotinsky Institute website. Okay? The Iron Wall was a text where Jabotinsky was arguing with left-wing Zionists at the time, right? And he was saying the following. He said, Zionism is colonialism. That's the premise of Jabotinsky. And he said to his left-wing Zionists, do you know of any case in history where the colonized accepted the colonizer? It's a rhetorical question, right? He said, of course not. He said, we aim to create a state where there are people. He said, that's called colonialism. There is no case where the colonized accept the colonizer. That's a fact. He said, therefore, either Zionism stops or it proceeds regardless of the Palestinian Arabs. And that's how we called them, by the way, Palestinian Arabs. This is 1923. Right? Well, it hasn't worked out that well. the Iron Wall, right? The alternative, now that we're in the realm of unfolding genocide, right? There is no alternative within Israeli society. Anyone who follows Hebrew language, media, since 7th of October 2023 is exposed to horrific genocidal rhetoric. Horrific. On the first few days after 7th of October, I remember seeing this poster hanging from one of the bridges on the Ayalon freeway in Tel Aviv, right? And it said, the image of victory in Gaza equals 0 people. There were numerous of these in public spaces. People celebrating killings on the radio and TV, in the elevator, in the grocery store, until today. There is no alternative, only from the outside. And the alternative is nowhere, no one is going anywhere, ideally, because we know what the Israeli government and the Israeli society, for the most part, want, because they're telling us, like Bezalel Smotrich, who I mentioned a few weeks ago, right? The Greater Israel Project. The alternative is 7.5 million Jews, 7.5 million Palestinians, right? Everyone recognized for their dignity, their rights, their equality, their belonging to the place. How does that manifest itself politically? There are many, many possibilities, right? I'm just a historian. It's also important to say, Israel had no right of self-defense in Gaza. According to international law, it had all the right to repel the attack within its sovereign territory, absolutely, according to international law, right? It has no right of self-defense in occupied territory. That's black and white international law. Self-defense does not apply in occupied territory. That's just international law. We'll come back to where is international law today. So the solution is coming to terms with a history that's been denied, blurred in the frame of international law, in the frame of Holocaust memory, in the frame of global Holocaust memory institutes. We'll see tomorrow by Holocaust scholars. We need to come to terms with it. As I said, there's a mountain of evidence. There's a library of research. We're in a university here. And there are cases in the recent past where incredible change happened. I'm thinking, of course, what am I thinking about? Well, there's these kinds of things that are incredibly, I mean, besides anything else, just to see the fall of a brutal dictator and mass murder and the release of prisoners is incredible. Who knows what will come? But that's just incredible. But I'm thinking about South Africa. No genocide like we're seeing in Gaza. This is a big, big difference, right? But the fall of apartheid, right? There are other cases that we can think about. I mean, we can even think, I mean, again, there's these kind of comparisons become very complex. One of the things that come to mind, Rwanda, where there was, of course, a massive, brutal genocide, right? Post-genocide Rwanda is hardly a model for anything, really, right? It's a political, authoritarian, violent state, right? But the idea of creating, right, a post-genocide state, not for Tutsis and Hutus, but for Rwandans, the idea of creating a post-apartheid South Africa for South Africans, right, which was actually a key element of the struggle against apartheid for decades from the grassroots, right? Declared openly. This is not about turning the tables. right? Now the majority blacks, of course, there were so many other groups than just black and whites, right? But not the majority black now will rule over the whites. No, which will really be a reproduction of the segregationist model. South Africa for South Africans, Rwanda for Rwandans. Israel not as a Jewish supremacist state. Not as a state that, unashamed, legislates in 2018 a Jewish nation state. Basic law. Israel doesn't have a constitution, so it has basic laws as a replacement. But in 2018, the state unashamed told us in its basic law, which is constitutional basically, right, that it is a Jewish nation state where anyone who's not a Jew, particularly the 20%, almost 2 million Palestinians, right, are second-class citizens. And this is a law, basic law, framed within explicit settler language. The state encourages the settlement of the land. Article 7 of the law. Not that. Why do Israelis use Nakba? Well, what we're experiencing now is an accident of the system, right? In the system of the new crime of genocide, international law, Holocaust uniqueness, Jews unique, Israel unique, right? This was never supposed to happen. That we see so clear evidence of genocide perpetrated by Israel. This was never supposed to happen. And I can tell you, by the way, that there's a growing consensus among international lawyers, right, that the ICJ will have no choice but to find Israel guilty of genocide. Because there is so much evidence, right? This is an absolute accident of the system. It was never supposed to happen, right? This is foundational to the post-World War II, post-Holocaust political and international legal system. And it happened, right, because of this view of Palestinians as colonized barbarians, because Israel is a settler colonial state and society. Because dehumanization of Palestinians has a significant history well before 7th of October, right? So after the Hamas-led attack on 7th of October, which was indeed a shock, right? It's always a shock, by the way. It was always a shock when the colonized rise up. I mentioned the Herero uprising in German Southwest Africa, which included a brutal attack against German settlers, right? The genocidal response is also, right, a response to this settler colonial shock. The colonized can do something. They're supposed to be barbarians, right? But they can do something incredible like this. And therefore, everything that wasn't supposed to surface, surfaced, right? Clear intent to destroy, right? Genocidal rhetoric that flowed not just in the heat of the moment until today, right? Nakba. I mean, in 2011, the state legislated a Nakba law, a memory law, right? That criminalized the mentioning of Nakba in relation to Israel's Independence Day, right? It didn't carry jail, but it carried significant financial implications for public institutions and their employees. But there was a law. Now suddenly, Nakba all over. Second Nakba, Gaza Nakba, again Nakba, 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 Nakba. Nakba means catastrophe in Arabic, right? Shoah, which is the Hebrew equivalent of Holocaust, also means catastrophe in Hebrew. But Nakba means catastrophe. So yes, Israelis now use it because it's out in the open. And the more it's out in the open, the more absurd, right? The upside down world that Biden created for us, right? And the mainstream media is continuing to throw in our face as if we don't have phones, as if we live in the 80s, right? So it's a sign of of absurdity. And we should respond, right, with something that now unfortunately has become radical, but it shouldn't be, an insistence on the truth, not as individuals, collectively and collaboratively. That's why I mentioned the encampments, right? Where different people for quite significant times, periods, right, actually managed to work through a lot of disagreements, right? Always when there's collaborations, we always find what we disagree on, right? And it always becomes a big deal, what we disagree on, right? No, these students, right, found a way to collaborate, to work together, to create an amazing vision of how life can be in those encampments, right? Praying together, studying together, struggling together. Yeah, of course there were problems. There were disagreements. Not everything went according to plan. Some people said things that they shouldn't have said in some cases. In most cases not, by the way, right? But it was an incredible vision of insisting on truth together. In the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, where I live, the students told the university a simple truth. There's a company on your campus, on our campus, right, that is involved in designing and manufacturing the robot dogs that Israel puts weapons on and uses to kill people in Gaza. We disagree. We want you to divest from this. This is not what a university should do. This is not what our university should do. Right? It's a simple truth. That's what we need to do in response to this absurdity in front of all of us. International law, Israel, Jews, Macron, Netanyahu. So international law is under massive attack now, right? We know that it's interesting, by the way, that we're always told that, you know, it's going to be bad, right? We said, first of all, it took some time, but eventually South Africa brought the charge of genocide in the ICJ, right? And then everyone said, there's no way that in the provisional rulings, right, the court will find that Israel is plausibly committing genocide in Gaza. And then they found that and reaffirmed that in the 2 additional provisional rulings, right? And then people said, well, the International Criminal Court, which is different, right? The International Criminal Court is about individual criminal responsibility, right? It's subject to the state parties, right? The Rome Statute, the 124 states that are part of the Rome Statute. The ICJ is the highest court of the UN system, right? And deals with states. So people said in the ICC case, right? There's no chance. I mean, the ICC is only, you know, African dictators, right? Or Putin, right? There's no chance that the ICC, that anything will move. And there's an open investigation against Israel, an open process. Okay, the investigation really since 2021, if I'm not mistaken, but the open process is since 2014, right? In the case of Israel, Palestine, and the ICC. So everyone said, no way, right? But then in April, Chief Prosecutor Karim Khan, a central figure of maintaining Israeli impunity, right, requested arrest warrants against Gallant and Netanyahu and against the Hamas leaders for war crimes and crimes against humanity, not genocide, but war crimes and crimes against humanity. And then everyone said, there's no way that there will be arrest warrants, right? There's no way that there will be arrest. And it took 6 months, right? You know how many people Israel killed in those 6 months? How much it destroyed? It invaded Lebanon in those 6 months, right? But after 6 months, right, the pre-trial chamber could not, in the face of overwhelming evidence, but issue arrest warrants. The first Western leader ever to face arrest warrants in the International Criminal Court. Now there's a massive attack, right? We know that the US government has previously threatened the court, censors, the former chief prosecutor, court officials, right, withdrew visas, froze bank accounts, right? We know that the US has a law that if a US national, right, is apprehended by the court to stand trial in The Hague, the US will send its army, right, to make sure that that doesn't happen.
It's called the Belgium Liberation Act.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah, can you imagine US commando in The Hague, right? Please step aside, sir. I'm going to have to shoot you now. We know that Israel and the US do not want the International Criminal Court, do not want international law at all. Right? What is international law in the eyes of Israel? All anti-Semites. We're coming to your question here. That is a reason to believe that it's very important that we maintain international law, actually. Now, international law is very, as I said, its foundation after World War II is based on Nakba denial, on Holocaust uniqueness, on Jewish uniqueness, on Israeli uniqueness, on Israeli impunity. But all this is changing now. We're in a process of incredible change, right? And what's international law? It's institutes, right, with people. If Karim Khan, right, and he said once he's requested the arrest warrants, he had this press conference, it wasn't a press conference, it was a video press release, right, which was very unusual, by the way. The court never does that, but they did that, okay, for whatever reasons. But the point is that if you listen to that press release, it's about impunity. And Karim Khan, who is central in Israeli impunity, right, now comes and says, we can't have impunity anymore. So we're in a process of incredible change. Also, again, we're up against incredible power. Anyone who's interested in this change, in all spheres, including in international law, we're up against incredible power, right? But incredible power in our lifetime, well, some of our lifetimes at least, has crumbled. We've seen incredible power crumble. I said South Africa, for example. Who would have imagined in 1988, right, that Nelson Mandela would be out of prison and heading a post-apartheid South Africa? But that happened, right? Who would have imagined the fall of the Soviet Union? In that same year, 1988, say, right? Who? Incredible power in certain circumstances and intense crises of various sorts crumbles. So, one last comment in relation to this and what you asked. One of the mechanisms, right, to maintain the authority of incredible power is to double down on uniqueness. And one of the mechanisms to do this, right, is the weaponization of the struggle against anti-Semitism, right? Part of the weaponization of the Holocaust. What does that mean? That the struggle against anti-Semitism, which emerged with the emergence of anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism is a political movement with the new term anti-Semitism that anti-Semites themselves coined to describe themselves. This is Germany in the late 19th century, right? These people are thinking about two things. One, Jews in racial terms, right? And two, that it's very, very bad that there was emancipation of Jews in Germany, and we should roll back emancipation. That was their concrete political agenda, right? From that moment, we also have the rise, and this spreads then to Hungary and to all other places, and morphs and changes, of course, and we have this history of anti-Semitism. And then we have the struggle against anti-Semitism that, of course, emerged with Jews, right, facing this political assault, right, and in some cases, some of their allies. What was the assault that Jews faced? They faced an assault by states or people who understood themselves as acting on behalf of states, right, against people, Jews. That's the struggle against anti-Semitism in a nutshell, right? It's to protect a people from discrimination, persecution, and violence, exclusion by states. Okay? What's the weaponization of the struggle? The weaponization of the struggle is now not to protect the people, but to protect a state that identifies as the Jewish state, which is, of course, an exclusionary framework, right? From criticism of its attack against the people, Palestinians, a world turned upside down. Okay? Now, the Zionist project, a key element was to collapse a state and a people, right? There are so many ways, I mentioned yesterday when I talked about Roma and Jews, there are so many ways of being a Jew. There are so many ways of being any identity, right? Because it's shaped by all kinds of other ways in which we identify. We're fans of sports clubs, we're parents, we're siblings, I don't know, we're members of a club that loves cats. That's me. But there's so many ways of being a Jew. Zionism, nationalism, came and said, no, after 48, Zionism as it manifested itself in the Israeli state, which was a nation state and a settler state, right? Now, there's only one way of being a Jew, Zionist. Jews, Zionist, collapse. That's it, right? And now, if you're an anti-Zionist Jew, and there were many anti-Zionist Jews in the past, and there's also quite a few anti-Zionist Jews in the present, and more, right? Then this discourse now, one of its absurdities is that anti-Zionist Jews are anti-Semites now. Because they actually do what you're supposed to do if you take never again seriously. So that's back to the need that has become radical, right, to insist on the truth, right? That anti-Zionist Jews are, of course, not anti-Semites, right? That dismantling Sukkot of anti-Zionist Jews on American campuses is anti-Semitism. That a state and a political ideology is different than a people, and that we need to insist on this, again, regardless of who you are. So many people, right, also in the last two, 3 days here, right, have told me, well, you can say what you say, right, because you're an Israeli, you're a Jew. I'll add that also because I'm a man, right? And I have to say, I understand what we call in the US privilege. I understand it. And it's a real thing. But that's why I mentioned before, I tell students, let's go and talk on the sidewalk, 2 + 2 is 4. Is this 2 + 2 is 4? Does this rely, the truth of that, rely on anyone's identity? Do we need only certain people can say what we all see in front of our eyes? Describe it in simple terms? We have to, because once we, and this is the last thing I'll say, once we do this, once we remain in this framework of only certain people can say certain things, right? We accept the premise of the perpetrators. And we discard the victims. That's the most awful thing that you can do if you really take never again seriously. But we need to do it collectively and collaboratively. Yeah, if I take 5 students to chalk on the sidewalk 2 + 2 and 4, right? Then I have to face the Philadelphia, well, if I do it at UPenn, for example, I have to face, I don't teach at UPenn, but I have to face the Philadelphia police, and no one wants to face the Philadelphia police, I promise you, right? But if I take 500 students to chalk on the sidewalk, 2 + 2 is 4, the Philadelphia police will think twice. And if these 500 people remain there 1, 2, 3, 7, 8, 10, a month, 2 months, every day chalking on the sidewalk, that'll have an impact. It will. Right? Not in itself. Right? There's international law, there's divestment, right? Divestment now is not this kind of, oh, anti-Semites. It's international law, right? If a state is plausibly perpetrating genocide, then if you're collaborating with the state, you're plausibly complicit in genocide. We have, this is really lasting, okay? We have an opinion by the International Court of Justice, right? So not a ruling, but an opinion on the case of the Israeli occupation just recently. Another case in the ICJ. I don't know if you've heard about it, right? What a surprise. The Israeli occupation in its entirety is illegal in international law. It took a long time to get here, right? A long, long, painful time. But we got here. The International Court of Justice has ruled that Israeli occupation in its entirety, not this or this or this or this or that act, right, is illegal in international law. What this means is this goes now to the General Assembly of the UN. It goes now to the potential of sanctions, right? And people can continue to shout however much they want, anti-Semitism, right? It changes nothing in this fact of truth. The Israeli occupation is illegal. And if it's illegal, it's not just now Israel genocide in Gaza, right? It's any connection with Israel that upholds an illegal occupation becomes illegal in international law. That's massive. Change is already happening, right? So don't tell me I'm a Jew and an Israeli and a man. All of us, let's be Israeli Jewish men, right? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That really rocked us, I think. So we'll be here tomorrow. Thank you very much. You're a tough man.
What?
You're a tough man.
I am?
You are.
Oh, nuts.
You're very right, but your problem is you will need a Palestinian Mandela.
I don't think so.
Yes, because
But
what I mean by that,
we have them. We have them.